I would like to thank the Women's Club for having called me. And like Neerja mentioned, thanks a lot for, what we want to do is to break the stereotype. The stereotype is that, ladies' club should meet together and discuss cooking recipes and where do you get nice saris and stuff like that, right? We want to actually break the stereotype because the problem is we have been cut off in this stereotype for so long, right? Where you are actually brought up, even children, little girls are brought up in their families with the idea of the stereotype, where they always think that there's a certain way in which they are required to behave and required to, have their interests, right? And like Neerja mentioned, what I would talk to you about today is one about obviously the beauty of astronomy, because that's what I've been doing for the past many years. And the other thing is also breaking of the stereotype, because it is essential that we pass on this message to complete society, right? Like I'll be talking about later on of how these stereotypes are so inbred in our minds, of what girls need to be doing, of what boys need to be doing. And so in a way, indirectly, we actually force the girls or the women in our families or in our, in our circles, we force them to take certain career choices because we actually think that that's the right thing to be done, right? And when actually, in principle, there is no reason for such a stereotype. There is no reason why boys should not be cooking food and why girls should not be doing rocket science, right? There is no such this thing, and that's what I would like to convey to you in this thing. So, so thanks, Neerja, for giving me this opportunity. Because I also believe that it is the duty of, like me, the scientific community, to actually convey to the others that there is a very strong requirement for societies to change, because a change in society will cause a change in attitude, and that is what is going to cause a change in our futures, right? We have to teach our sons to cook food so that tomorrow when they have their wives and their families, they can cook food and participate in the household activities, right? There's no reason why they should not be doing that, right? So that's what I will this thing. So I've called my thing She Sees Stars, Women Astronomers in Time. I teach at the Maulana Azad, the National Urdu University. This is the physics department with astronomy too. So people who do PhDs under me do it essentially in astronomy. And you can always get in touch with me whenever you want at priya.hassan@gmail.com. Oh, one sec. I'll just, I think I forgot to get it on record mode. I'll just do that. One sec. Oh, it's recording. Right. Yeah. Okay. So let's see how does it all start. Now you look at this picture itself. This is also quite a biased picture showing man's view of the heavens. And this is not a computer generated picture. This is a real picture. This is a real picture. The guy you see over here, his name is Dorje Anchuk. He is the chief engineer for India's highest observatory, which is in Ladakh. Okay, this is in Hanle. And you can see what a beautiful sky you have over here. For people of you who know how to recognize constellations, this is the Scorpius constellation with Antares, a red star over here. And you can see what a beautiful sky they have. And what's actually been done now is people are actually trying to conserve dark skies to, like you would conserve a wildlife sanctuary, you actually conserve certain places which have dark skies, because having a dark sky is not a given thing in today's time. In most cities, you can hardly see 10 objects in the sky, right? While here you can see you have such a beautiful this thing. And this has India's highest optical telescope, which is 2-meter telescope, which is in Ladakh. Now, how did it all start? How did, astronomy is considered the oldest of sciences. So how did it exactly start? How did we actually, have that connect with the stars? Now, what we basically try to do in astronomy or in day-to-day life also is we actually look for patterns, right? Patterns in space, patterns in time. Like what you can see over here, these are patterns in space, some kind of a design. Or there's a pattern in time. When I get up in the morning, I feel hungry. Then when I eat something, then I feel good. Then I can do something. So we actually develop a pattern or a routine for ourselves depending on these patterns that we see. Now, what is the simplest pattern which we see? The simplest pattern we see is that of day and night, right? And what do? We say the sun rises, we notice that the sun rises from the same direction. We call that direction east, and says it sets in a certain direction, which we call the west. That's how we define our east and west. And we know that approximately the day-night separation is approximately 12 hours between a day and a night, right? So that's the observation, the day and night separation. Now, the next question which comes up is, why do we have this separation, right? Why do we have such a thing of day and night? Now, so the explanation was, there are two ways you could explain it. Either you say the sun is going around the earth, right? Which you can see over here, that the sun is going around the earth. And when the earth faces the sun, that's when we have day. And when the sun does not face the sun, that's when we have night. That's the simple explanation we have for the day-night pattern, which we see in our skies. Now, this very basic information, whether the sun is going around the earth or the earth is going around the sun, but we know that this is what causes this diurnal movement, this daily movement or this daily pattern of day and night, right? So how could we use it? Now consider you are a caveman, right, or a cave woman. So what one actually sees, that supposing if you had a tree, what you notice is, this is called a gnomon or a stick, okay? So if the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, and I have a stick put onto the ground, I will see that I get a shadow from the stick. So as the sun is over here, I'll get the shadow somewhere over here. As the sun rises, the shadow moves more here. And as the sun moves towards the other side, the western side, my shadow will come into this, right? And this is what you call a sundial. That is how you could actually measure the time of the day just using the motion of the sun. So if you actually practice this, you know, if you could actually, when you're out in the open, you can actually just look at the position of the shadow. And once you know whether you are before 12 o'clock in the morning or after 12 o'clock in the morning, you can directly define what is the direction of the east or the west, right? So if you look out of your house, look at the trees, see where the shadows are, you directly know where's east or west, and you can time it. So whatever here is just a simple activity which can be done in a school, where you can actually have a dial, right, where you can actually measure the time. And school, obviously you have a problem, you can't measure this in the night when the sun is not there, but school hours are daytime. So actually school children can actually use this to define the time in their school without even looking at a watch. You can directly just see what's the time, just looking at the shadows, right? So that itself, the basic idea that the sun rises and sets, which causes this, can actually give you this concept of time, or how would you actually measure time? You know, if you're stranded on an island or something like that, or even you just look out of the window. The next thing which we observe in terms of patterns is the pattern of seasons. We saw the seasons, where essentially we do it in terms of difference in temperature, which also relates to a difference in the kind of crops or the fruits or the flowers which you have, right? And therefore, seasons was very important specifically for Indian culture because it is related to agriculture. So you essentially need to know, when is it going to be warm, when is it going to rain, when is it going to be cool, so that you actually know how to plan your agricultural activities. So now, how did people realize, how do you determine seasons? Now here I have taken a slight jump, where I've actually shown you that this is the sun and the earth is going around the sun. Now as the earth goes around the sun, in the direction of the sun, if you see the direction of the sun, you need to see what are the stars behind the sun. Where is the sun lying in a certain time of the year? Now, if you want to see this, obviously you can't see this during the day because the sun is too bright, but you'll typically see this at the time of sunset or at the time of sunrise, when you can see a few of the stars near the sun, right? And that's, for example, that in this period, you will see that typically here, if we are in April, you will see that the sun is in Aries constellation, right? So essentially, like Ugadi, which we celebrated yesterday, which was considered the beginning of the year, is when you see the sun in Aries constellation, and it's your first new moon. Because as per the Indian calendar system, you actually start the calendar with the moon, and that would be Ugadi, which is the beginning of the yug or the year, right? Now, depending on that, so all you need to do is observe the sun at the time of sunset or sunrise, see the constellation in which it lies. And these are all these zodiacal constellations, which all of you are very familiar with, because that's the same constellation in which the sun was when you were born, right? So essentially, everybody, I'm sure most people know how to actually know which constellation is the sun in at different times of the year. And once you know that, you will know whether you are in spring or in summer or in winter, or which part of the year or season are you in, once you know where the sun is. So people realize this pattern very well, that this is actually telling you where is the sun lying, which will actually define your season, which will be what is related to agriculture. Now, to make that easier, we also plan in festivals. Like you have the festival of Baisakhi, which was also yesterday, which is again the harvest festival. So you again plan in the harvest festival with exactly this time, which is the time to actually harvest the crop, right? So seasons were what actually led us to define what are called calendars. That is, we decided a calendar is a system of organizing dates. How do you organize dates? You basically give it by giving names to periods of time. For example, a day. A day is the day-night pattern which we know. What about weeks? A week was defined as the number of naked eye objects you can see in the sky. So that is essentially 5 planets and the sun and the moon, right? And all of your, I mean, if you, especially in Hindi, if you say Shanivar, Shani is for Saturn, Guruvar is for Jupiter, right? Somvar, Mangalvar, Mangal is for Mars, right? So essentially what was done is a week was planned based on the number of celestial objects we are observing in the sky with our naked eyes, right? The next thing which was made, the next measure of time is a month. Now, the month is just based on the lunar cycle, right? The lunar cycle is something very, very obvious. If you look up at the sky, you can easily see what phase the moon is. And you know that the moon takes 28 days from phase to phase, right? And that was exactly what defined a month, right? And then now you come to a year. A year is the complete period of revolution of the earth around the sun, which is again the same thing that, for example, it would be the time taken the sun to move from Aries to come back from Aries to Aries, or whichever constellation you were talking about. So the period that the sun takes to come back to that very constellation is what we call a year, right? And therefore, these cycles were basically synchronized with periodic phenomena. And on the basis of this, we planned calendars, right? So the Islamic calendar essentially is a lunar calendar. It's only on the moon. So all you have to do is just observe the phases of the moon, right? But because of that, because the phases of the moon is 28 days, which does not come to be a multiple of 365 days. So therefore, what happens is, if you, all of you all, some of you all may be aware of that, that's why, say, for example, the month of Ramazan comes in different seasons, right? It is not planned to fall in the same season. For the simple reason is that you are actually planning it with a 28-day month, which does not do 365 days. So every year, there's a difference in 20 days. You push it up by 20 days, right? The lunar calendar. And therefore, for example, Ramzan falls in different parts of the year. But that was fine for the Islamic calendar because these were essentially nomads, right? They were not staying in a place and doing agriculture where they needed to be so dependent on the seasons. They did not need that. They could just move with their cattle and their people so that they, adjusted their wherever they were. Now, there's some cultures, for example, the Persian culture is a solar calendar. It just depends upon the sun. That's it. And then you have other calendars, which are luni-solar calendars. So, for example, China or even the Hindu calendar, which we have, is a luni-solar calendar, which actually makes it very convenient because, number one, the moon is observed. You can see phases of the moon. Based on that, you define your months. And then it was also very essential that since India was an agricultural country, right, they basically needed it to coincide with the seasons. And therefore, you had to use the sun too. And hence our calendar is a luni-solar calendar. Chinese calendar as well as the Hebrew calendar are also examples of luni-solar calendar. And what was done is festivals. Festivals were important markers of astronomical events, right? And therefore they told you when was Baisakhi, when was it the harvest season, when is it Holi, when is it the beginning of summer, spring, when is it Pongal, the Pongal period, you need to know that. So essentially, if you see, almost all the Indian festivals are all planned as per the season, because there were seasonal activities which had to be done based on the festival. So if you see, the festival also involved things which were dependent on the season. So for example, in Pongal or Sankranti, you have Tilpatti, right? You don't have Tilpatti in another season, right? It is planned specifically for that season. So specifically the or even Ugadi, the neem flowers, that is the specific time when you get neem flowers, and hence Ugadi coincides with that. And it's not a coincidence, it is actually planned to be like that, right? So you have to find neem flowers when there is Ugadi, right? Because it is planned like that. So festivals were markers of these important events, which actually kept you in synchrony. So here you're actually seeing that you're synchronizing your life with events which are happening in the heavens, and accordingly, life is being planned or being celebrated. Now, the next thing that people, when you look up at the sky, you see the stars. Now, if you look, what you see down here, this is an example of the stars rising. They exactly rise and set exactly like the sun. So if you had a camera with which you were just exposing, right, the movement of the stars, you would see that they rise from here and set over here, right, in this kind of a circular motion. There's a point over here which you see is not moving, okay? And that point is the point of the pole star or the Polaris, right? So this basically gives us an idea that the Earth is moving around an axis in such a way that all these stars are moving around in circles, but the central star over here, the center of this circle, is not moving. And that center of the circle, we identified with the position of a star, which we call the Dhruva Tara or the pole star, which is the axis of rotation of the Earth in the northern hemisphere, right? So all stars moved like this. But there were these other objects in the sky, which were planets. And planets did not move like that. The planets, number one, did not twinkle. They were brighter. And their movements were, kind of loopy movements. They actually went back and forth. They in different parts of the sky. Their movement was not so regular. So there was always the confusion as to what is this reason. So one obvious reason was that obviously planets are closer to us than the stars, and hence we can see their movement more enhanced, right? For stars, we don't see it so enhanced because the stars are far away from us. The movement is less. But planets, since they are closer, we see the movement more. But for some strange reason, they have this loopy kind of movement, right? But that's when people actually came up with what is called the geocentric model. The geocentric model is basically the model in which we consider that the Earth is the center of the universe, right? Now, obviously, man has a good enough ego, and we had our own reasons to believe that the Earth is the center of the universe. And why was that? Because there were basically two observations. The first observation, that we observed that the sun appears to revolve around us. The moon and the planets have their own motions, but they also seem to be revolving around the Earth, right? Once a day. That is, if you saw Venus at a certain position today, tomorrow when you see it, you'll again see Venus approximately at the same position, right? The other thing which we observed was that the Earth seems to be unmoving, right? The ground below your feet is not moving. So you actually think that the Earth is unmoving, and therefore it feels solid, stable, stationary. And therefore for many, many, many centuries, Aristotle, Ptolemy, various other Greek philosophers believed the geocentric model. So what was considered here is that the Earth is the center, and these planets have, loopy motions. They go around what is called a deferent, and then there are epicycles, smaller loops, which the planets take to actually while they go around the Earth, right? So this was the model which was given by the geocentric theory. Now, the geocentric theory later on had to be dropped for the simple reason that people started observing. By then, by about 400 years back, we already had the advent of the telescope. Okay, so here the picture you see over here is of Galileo, and Galileo was the first man to actually use a telescope to look at the stars. And what he saw was something very strange. He actually looked at Venus. Venus is a bright object, And he saw that Venus actually shows phases. Okay, so it looked exactly like the moon. This is quite an easy thing to do. We can have some sky observing sessions, and you can actually see the phases of Venus. And the question was that why should Venus show phases, right? If Venus is going around the Earth, there's no reason why it should show phases. And here you can see these are the geocentric model where all these planets had these strange loops and all kinds of things to explain their motions. And that's when Copernicus, you see over here, he came up with a new theory, which was called the heliocentric. Helios is the sun, where he said that the sun is the center and the Earth and the various planets are going around the sun. The advantage in this was he could explain the motion of the planets in the sense of their epicycles and their deference, as well as he could explain why Venus had phases. And this is a direct application of what in science is called Occam's razor. That, for example, if you have a phenomena for which you have two opposing explanations, for example, you have the geocentric and the heliocentric theory, right? It's for the same set of evidence. Then our minds actually prefer the explanation that makes the fewest assumptions. So what you see is in the heliocentric theory, you have the minimum amount of assumptions. All these planets have, decent, good orbits around the sun. You don't need to have all the complications which you have in a geocentric theory, right? And therefore, Copernicus and then astronomers after him very strongly supported this heliocentric theory, which could in a much more simpler way explain the motion of planets, right? And various other observations, which include the phases of Venus, which includes the satellites of Jupiter and various other things that Galileo saw through his telescope. Another very important application of astronomy to human life has been navigation. Now, it is very easy to actually, so we actually go to even train forest officers to actually find their position based on the stars. Because let's assume the forest officer is off and he's lost in the forest and his phone battery has died and stuff like that. Then you can actually use the stars to actually find your position. So for example, I think I already showed you that picture with star trails, where I showed you that for stars, you actually have this kind of a movement, and there's a point over here where there is no movement, right? So actually, and like I told you, that is the position of the pole star. Now, finding the pole star is not at all difficult. Many of you all may know this constellation. This is called the Ursa Major or the Saptarishi or the Big Dipper. And if you take these two stars from the Big Dipper, go about 5 times the distance, you will get the North Star or the pole star. The other way of getting the pole star is if you cannot see Saptarishi, then there's another constellation here called Cassiopeia, which looks like a W. So when Ursa Major has set, you will only see Cassiopeia. And if you see Cassiopeia, the bigger, it's a W, there's one which has a larger angle. If you bisect that angle, you will come straight here. This one is Polaris, the pole star. So either I extend these two 5 times here, I get Polaris, or I bisect this angle here and I come here. So that's Polaris. So using that, you can identify Polaris. The other option is, like I said, you keep looking at the stars and seeing the unmoving point, and you notice that is Polaris. So typically, if you're standing over here on the Earth, you will see stars rise over here and set over here. So for example, this is Cassiopeia, it's rising over here. This is Polaris. Then it comes up and then it sets. So that is east and that is west, right? This one is your pole star. So let's say let's assume you can identify the pole star. Once you identify the pole star, the elevation of the pole star, obviously if you're on the equator, right, the pole star is going to be exactly at 90 degrees, which is 90 minus your latitude, right? But if, for example, you're at 50 degrees latitude, then your pole star has it will be at an elevation of if it's at 50 degrees, that means your latitude is 40 degrees. Sorry, it's 50 degrees. So you're actually seeing the elevation of the pole star, and that directly gives you your latitude. You just see this angle. So this was the method that was used out in sea. If you're out in sea, you don't have any way to direct you. You actually look at the position of the pole star and find out your latitude. Now, let us look a little bit about history, right? European colonization. European colonization was basically based on conquering the seas, right? whether it was Britain or whether it was France, the big deal was about conquering the seas, because all the colonies which they went to, all of them had to be crossed by the seas so that you went there, right? But there were many stories about soldiers being lost at sea, basically because they could not define their position. So latitude was reasonably well defined, right? But longitude was a difficult job. So that's how when Christopher Columbus actually was trying to look for India, he went exactly in the opposite direction and he had no idea that he'd reached America, right? Because you had a problem with longitude, right? You did not know how to measure longitudes. And therefore, Britain as well as France, these were the two, the big colonial, giants who were actually looking for a way to actually define longitudes. And for longitudes, we don't have a marker. Like, for example, for latitudes, we have the pole star. For the longitude, we don't have anything. And therefore, the longitudinal problem was kind of solved when they defined a marker. And the marker was the prime meridian, 0 degrees longitude, right? And at that time, since Britain was a superpower, 72% of the earth was ruled by Britain. So in 1884, the prime meridian was actually defined. So this is the Greenwich Observatory, which is near London. And you can see over here, there's a point which is actually defined as the prime meridian, right? So if you stand over here, you'll be half on east and half on west. This is the Paris Observatory, which is also still exists in Paris. And that's how these countries, they found it very important to have organized observations of the stars. Now we'll see why. Because the longitude problem, like I told you, seafaring's greatest danger was getting lost. So what were the methods of actually finding out the longitude? One method was using what was called a marine chronometer. The concept is very simple. It's, for example, you started your journey in London, right? And you have a clock which is running on London time. For example, the lower clock, right? And then you go to another place, right? And you see when is your local noon. And you see the difference between your local noon and the noon at Greenwich, right? And essentially a 1 hour difference is a 15-degree difference in longitude. So what you needed to do is just have a clock on the ship, and the clock on the ship would actually measure, which would keep track of the time of the station where you left. And you can also you measure the local noon by looking at the sun, get the difference and get the longitude. But this was a very complicated job because you needed to have a clock when you're in a ship which is rocking, shaking, and you need the clock to work accurately, quite accurately, because 1 hour is 15 degrees of longitude. So if you actually go wrong by an hour or half an hour, you're really placing yourself quite wrongly, right? And people try to develop all kinds of clocks which could work efficiently on a rocking ship, right? Now, the other solution which was given to actually finding your position was actually a thing which was that if you actually look at the separation of a moon and a particular star, based on that separation, they used a book of tables to look up the predicted time and this thing. And this was put in books which were called almanacs or ephemeris, where you actually had tables for which star with reference to the moon or other positions. And you actually use that to actually find out these things. And therefore, it became very, very essential to have very accurate observations of the positions of stars from various places so that people could get their longitudes satisfactory. So typically, that was the work of the astronomers, say in Greenwich or even in Paris Observatory, to accurately catalog the positions of stars for different places in different times of the year. And even to this date, here I have put an almanac, which is a very old one, 1739. But this one which you have is the latest one. So what you see is to this date on ships, you always have an almanac. There's always an almanac provided on the ship so that in case of no other information, the sailors can actually use the almanac to find out their position in sea, right? That is to find out their longitude. And therefore, sailors all obviously did know a certain amount of astronomy, right? So what you see is that human development, right? Whether it was agriculture, whether it was colonization, which was related to development, etc., were all very closely related to the stars. The next connection we have to stars is the story of astrology, right? Where people then also, my long time back, they had a feeling that, oh, these things have to do something with my life, right? Whether Venus is in the sky or not in the sky has to do with something about how well I do in my exams, or, various things like that. So while astronomy is the study of the universe and contents outside the Earth's atmosphere, where we study it as a science to study why, how, where of all these objects, astrology, what it basically does, it studies the same objects. You're studying celestial objects, you're seeing their positions. But for example, you say, oh, Jupiter's now in the sky, it is in your constellation, and hence you're going to have some problems because of that. Or because Mars is in your constellation, you're going to have something. So I've just put two funny memes over here. So this is a slightly biased. I'm sorry, it may sound a little this thing, but essentially that's what it is. The difference between astrology and astronomy is a difference in IQ points, because in principle, the myth that the position of stars or planets could actually affect your future, your day, your destiny is something pretty, it's not established. It is just a myth, right? And for those of you who are Big Bang lovers, you have here a conversation between Penny and Sheldon, where Penny tells Sheldon that her sun sign is Sagittarius, which probably tells you way more than you need to know. So Sheldon says, yes, it tells us that you participate in the mass cultural delusion that the sun's apparent motion relative to an arbitrarily defined constellation at the time of your birth somehow affects your personality, which actually tells you that the whole, so-called logic behind astrology is absolutely illogical, right? So I'll use this opportunity to tell you that also, that though it actually uses the position of celestial objects, it may sound scientific, but it is
आपको आवाज आ रही मेरी?
It is definitely not. Yeah. Okay. So let's move from astrology. The other important implications that astronomy has had on our lives is basically of technology transfer. There's a lot of technologies which you won't even be aware of, which have got developed because of development of astronomy, as well as space science, which is strongly related to astronomy. So for example, the Kodak films, they were originally created so that solar astronomers could record changes in the surface of the sun. And then that actually developed it to, get applied onto commercial production, and where it's already used now for medicine, for spectroscopy, for various other applications, dentistry, diagnostics, etc. It's also interesting for you to note that CCDs, the digital cameras which you have on your phones, on your camcorders, on your computers, through which I'm talking just now, these were also developed, CCDs, which is a charged coupled device. It is what gives you a digital image. This was actually developed for the Hubble Space Telescope. So when the Hubble Space Telescope was being launched, people were designing some kind of a camera which could give very precise and good images of the sky. And that's when Boyle and Smith actually developed the CCD, for which they got a Nobel Prize also in 2009. And that's the very same CCD which is being used on all your cameras, webcams, mobile phones, everything. In the aerospace center, defense satellites, right? They are essentially telescopes, but they are pointed towards the Earth. And they need identical technology, as that's what's used in astronomy. So therefore, processing satellite images, etc., uses the same software and processes as astronomical images. Similarly, observation of stars, models of stars, these are also used to differentiate between rocket plumes, cosmic objects, as well as early warning systems. Observations of stellar distribution in the skies are used to calibrate or telescopes. They are also used in aerospace engineering. GPS, which all of you all have on your phones and various other devices. This is the global positioning system. This basically relies on astronomical objects. So you basically use astronomical objects like quasars, distant galaxies, etc., to get accurate positions. So you use satellites which actually look at those objects, find their positions, and with that you can get GPS. And with GPS, you know that the accuracy with which you're getting positions on the Earth is amazing, right? You Swiggy order yourself a meal, the guy comes to your house, right? The maximum error he'd have in position would be maximum of kilometer. But other than that, he can easily pinpoint your position with GPS, which is also another thing from space technology. In the energy sector, using various renewable energy sources, chargeable batteries, which you have on your phone, they were also devised for space technology, right? And for example, all the technology which is used to image X-rays, right? This was actually technology which was developed for X-ray telescopes, and now it is used to monitor plasma fusion and various X-ray imaging devices. X-rays itself they are offshoots from that technology. One must realize that when a company, for example, wants to actually start a technology, right? The funding for the technology in the sense of, thinking up new ideas is not exactly there. So what they basically do is, for example, you know that there is CCD technology, then you adapt that to make a digital camera on your phone. But the technology has already been planned and thought up by somebody else. It is just adapted by the company for their product so that the product can sell, right? But that company, the R&D of that company is going to work basically on the adaptation of existing technologies. But they do not build technology on their own because they are not working at that level. At that level, then it would require a lot of funding and a lot of this research which is done. Not everything gives you an end result, right? And therefore, companies would be obviously wary in investing so much of money into that kind of research. So, okay, I'll continue. So, for example, medicine. You'd be also interested to know that, for example, all your medical imaging, which, for example, CAT scans, MRIs, PET scans, all these technologies which are there, they were essentially image processing technologies of astronomy, right? With which you could get digital images, with which you could learn how to process it, the digital images to get certain things. And that's how they adapted it. And that has been then picked up by the medical field. So there are a lot of astronomers and medical people also who work together because there's a lot of common working areas. Also, for example, in astronomy, we use something called clean working areas, which are areas which are used for space technology, because you want satellites to go from clean environments where there is no bacteria, no other impurity. And therefore, the clean room protocols, air filters, bunny suits, etc., which were developed for space technology, these are the ones which are actually being used in hospitals, pharmaceutical labs. Oh, I've got even many more. And so here you have camcorders, electromagnetic interference, technology for space shuttles, and daily life, like I told you, smartphones, the CCDs on them, the batteries on them, the GPS that's being used on them, the celestial navigation, etc., is all coming from there. You'd be surprised to know that even your comfy bed, the mattress you're sleeping on, memory foam, right? Memory foam wasn't initially made to make things comfortable. It was actually made to reduce impact in the event of a crash, okay, specifically for a space shuttle crash. And that's when the technology was developed of memory foam. And that's when they realized, oh, you could use memory foam in mattresses and shoes and, in various things. And that's just an offshoot of space technology. Climate study. Climate study is a very important offshoot of space technology, because using that you can track weather patterns, storms, monsoons, droughts, wildfires, tornadoes, hurricanes, because satellites can track your day-to-day weather patterns, depending on which you can, plan your activities, save millions of lives. So, so you can see that there are many, many ways, whether we like it or not, there are many ways in which astronomy or our connect to the stars has actually, influenced our lives to a very strong extent. I don't have the time to talk about that today, but essentially, all in your bones, the calcium in your bones, for example, which is there, it was fused in some star. Because when the universe was produced, it was just full of hydrogen and helium. You didn't have heavy elements. All the heavy elements were fused by stars, in stars. And therefore, the calcium in your bones, all the heavier elements that you have, the iron, all of them is also a byproduct of stellar evolution. So our connect to stars is so very strong. So another important part of astronomy, which I have also been involved in, is on passing science to the masses. Astronomy is a brilliant tool to actually describe science to people, because you see how in astronomy you're constantly using scientific concepts to explain things, right? And whatever said and done, but astronomy has a certain glamour, right? The pictures which you have are so beautiful. It is appealing to everyone, right? So I'm going to do a personal advertisement. I run something called Shrishti Astronomy. And what we do is we do outreach and education from school level to college level to university level to all levels. And I'd be happy if any of you all would like us to do workshops, talks, sessions in schools, in colleges, in university, wherever it is. We'd be really happy to do that. And obviously, we don't charge it. This is not a profit organization. It is just being done out of interest. So do approach me if you would like us to this thing. We have been working with lots of schools and groups in Hyderabad. Typically, I've been working a lot with underprivileged children, and so I'd be happy to participate in any such activity you are interested in. Okay, so what does astronomy do? Astronomy, like I said, studies anything outside the Earth's atmosphere. So essentially here I have a picture of the solar system. So it is the sun and the planets. Then you come out of it, you are coming out of the planet, the solar system, the Kuiper belt exists. We won't go into details. Then there's the galaxy which we belong to, which is called the Milky Way. Now the Milky Way is part of what is called the local group. And there's a local group of galaxies, which is part of the Virgo supercluster of galaxies, which is part of the visible universe. Okay. So astronomy covers all these fields, okay, from planets to stars to galaxies to quasars to black holes to all these objects. And all of them are very interesting objects to study, all of them with different kind of phenomena taking place and lots of interesting things happening. Now the next question, can women do science, right? Now, all of you all have definitely seen these pictures of ISRO women when you had the Mangalyaan launch, etc., right? Of various, role models we do have. To be a rocket scientist, you could be wearing saris with flowers on your hair. It does not have to mean that you have to appear westernized or appear, modern in that sense. So you can see that what was unique about India's picture with Mangalyaan, etc., was we actually showed that you had, these traditional looking women, right? Which most people think are, harmless. Another fear that people have is that if people get too professional, then they'll go Western in their ways and they'll, give up on our traditions and our culture and stuff like that. But almost all these women, which you see over here, all these women are normal women, which live normal lives, right? And so these women have husbands and children and homes, and you can be doing all those things at the same time while you are studying astronomy, right? It does not mean that to study it you have to be of a particular kind. That's not true. You can be of any kind of a background, and you could be doing this business, right? It does not imply a certain category of people, who appear over enlightened or stuff like that. These are regular people, right? Now, what are the key issues about women doing science? The most important issue is the stereotype problem, right? When little girls are gifted Barbie dolls for their birthdays, while boys are given Lego blocks and they are given machines and some kind of, more constructive kind of a thing. Girls are given kitchen sets and they are supposed to be liking things like that, right? And the problem is, even in you and me, these stereotypes are so deeply within us that we do not even realize that it is part of our, it's part of ourselves, right? For example, training girls to be cooking at home, right? While boys, you say, oh, don't worry, you can just Swiggy order and do your thing, right? We do not think that our sons need to learn to cook, while our daughters better learn to do that, right? And therefore, these stereotypes are so ingrained in us, and they all the time come in the way. They all the time come in the way because of what we think girls should be doing and boys to be doing. So what is the solution? The first step is to educate, right? So when you're educating girls, you don't tell girls, oh, all girls, you'll take up biology. If you want sciences, do biology or chemistry. The boys will do physics and maths, right? That's not a right deal. You have to obviously educate the child in all subjects, and the kid has to decide whether I like this or that, right? So there is no harm if your son says, oh, I want to take up a career in catering. I want to become a cook. That's fine. There is no reason why you should think that doing something like that would be, not manly or stuff like that. The other issue which we have in India or in all over the world is the problem of recruitment. If a man and a woman go for the same job and apply for the same job, generally, in most cases, preference is given to the man because it is considered that the man is running a home and it is more essential for him to get a job. While even I've faced it where people tell you, why do you need to work? Your husband is earning, right? You don't need to earn anything. You can do a little bit for pocket money, but you don't need to earn. So recruitment is a very important thing. So that goes at the level of people when they are recruiting people. And then the important next problem is retaining that workforce. So you have a young girl who studies and she gets a job, but then she gets married and she has children, and then she's faced with the thing that, if she has to prove that she's a good mother, she needs to drop her job and sit at home with the children, right? So there has to be a machinery which can help women retain their jobs. These are in the form of creches, in form of household help. A lot of it could be even family members who cooperate. I had my mother-in-law, my mother, various people who contributed, in looking after children at different times. So you do require some support either from your family or from society, which will actually help you to retain your position. And the important thing is sensitization. Sensitization, which you call gender sensitization, where people are made to realize as to what is it for you to have women in your workforce and how should things be accordingly planned, right? Now, I'll also talk about some role models as examples of cases where you can see where, there has been no issue in women doing things, right? So one of the earliest role models which we have for astronomy typically is Hypatia, who is considered amongst the earliest women astronomers. She was not just an astronomer, she was a philosopher, a mathematician from Alexandria, Egypt. And she's the first female mathematician whose life was reasonably well recorded. But if you actually, like you see in the picture over here, she had a tragic end, right? Because again of the kind of things that people face. Here you see a picture of Caroline Herschel. Caroline Herschel was the sister of a very famous astronomer called William Herschel. Now, William Herschel, her brother, he actually had a very good telescope with which he was actually observing. And Caroline, it is often considered that women are better observers than men because women pay attention to a lot of detail, which men often do not. So is the belief. And therefore, she actually discovered a whole lot of comets. So comets in the sky would actually look at as very fuzzy, diffuse kind of objects. Okay, and she actually catalogued a whole bunch of them. And there's a comet named after her too. And she was the first woman who was actually given a gold medal by the Royal Astronomical Society. Now, the Royal Astronomical Society was obviously a very bourgeoisie, male-dominated kind of a society where women obviously did not have a place. So she was the first who actually got a gold medal from them and who was even made a member of the Royal Astronomical Society. And I would also like you to pay attention on the dates. Look at this. This is 1828. This is just 200 years back, reasonably recent, right? Where you did not even have a woman in the Royal Astronomical Society, right? 200 years. And then she became a member of the Royal Irish Academy, etc. And she has various things about her. Another very good example of women, this thing is Jocelyn Bell. Now, Jocelyn Bell was actually doing her PhD in the University of Cambridge in 1969. And she actually was, what you see on the background is she actually constructed a radio telescope. Okay, so she was actually doing instrumentation. And she developed this radio telescope along with her PhD supervisor, Anthony Hewish. And what they were basically doing is that they were studying planetary scintillations, okay, while studying quasars. And she suddenly saw these pulses, okay, pulses of signals coming from these objects which she was observing. And she called them the little green men, okay, because it was considered these signals are probably alien signals which are coming with a certain periodicity, right, which is specifically coming for us. And so the source was called the Little Green Men source, LGM. And Jocelyn Bell was actually so first of all, she thought that it was probably some error in her observations, right? Due to which she was seeing this thing, because it was not clear why was she seeing these pulses. And it was considered, and then later on she established that this was not aliens, but this was a natural phenomena coming from objects which are called pulsars. Pulsars are objects, they are stars which are very highly magnetized. Okay, so think of it as a rotating torch. So because they are magnetized, they cannot give you light in all directions. They only give you in a certain direction. So if you have a rotating torch, so whenever the torch faces you, you'll get the signal. Otherwise, you will not get the signal. So like a rotating torch, it gives you the signals. And that's what she established. Now, this was such a momentous discovery that in 1974, the Nobel Prize was given for it. But the tragedy of the whole thing was that the Nobel Prize was given only to her supervisor, that is Anthony Hewish, because it was considered, oh, she was just a PhD student who was working on the instructions of her supervisor. And therefore, the man behind it is actually Anthony Hewish. And the Nobel went to him, not to her, and without even a mention of her. If you actually see the citation given by the Nobel Committee to Anthony Hewish, it does not even mention the name of Jocelyn Bell. Now, the whole world was obviously very upset about it, but that is how it was decided. And Jocelyn Bell continued her work. She has been very active in astronomy itself. She's currently visiting professor at the University of Oxford, in Mansfield, in various places. And she has been trying to work very hard against the discrimination being done towards women. And 50 years after her role in this discovery, the Breakthrough Prize, if you all have heard about the Breakthrough Prize, which actually gives much more than a Nobel Prize in terms of money, she actually got the Breakthrough Prize in 2018 and of $3 million. And she's donated the complete money to the Institute of Physics to fund PhD scholarships for underrepresented physics students in the UK, as well as to order to elevate this country's diversity issues. So Jocelyn Bell is still very much alive, and she's still very, very active in the work she does for women as well as the underrepresented. Another very beautiful example of great women in astronomy is Margaret Burbidge. She's also a fellow of the Royal Society. And Burbidge actually worked again in the University of Cambridge. She worked with her husband, Geoffrey Burbidge, as well as Fowler and Hoyle. They actually worked on what is called stellar synthesis. That is, how do stars synthesize elements? Okay, so they start off with hydrogen and helium, and then there are various processes with which they build heavier and heavier elements. Like what I was telling you about, the calcium in your bones is from stars. So she was basically working on this. So this is called stellar nucleosynthesis. That is, how do nuclei synthesize in stars to actually form heavier elements. Now, this was also a very momentous discovery for which the Nobel Prize was given in the year 1983. And the tragedy in this again was it was only given to Fowler. Margaret was not given the Nobel, nor was she, again, she was not even mentioned in it. And so the 1983 Nobel Prize was shared by Fowler with Chandrasekhar, but Burbidge was not included, when actually the bulk of the work was done by Margaret, okay, by Margaret Burbidge for this. But it was very conveniently ignored, just ignored. Now, Burbidge obviously continued her work. It's really interesting to actually see her life. Her husband was also an astronomer. So often she worked with her astronomer husband, and there are stories of how she worked at various places, even without pay or with less pay, and somehow managed her way through, right? So, for example, she was even made the director of the Greenwich Observatory, which we just saw some time back. And at that time, the director of the Greenwich Observatory was also called the Astronomer Royal, okay? But when her time came and she was made director, it was essential that they did not make a woman Astronomer Royal. And therefore, Martin Ryle, who was another Nobel laureate, he was given Astronomer Royal, while Burbidge was made this thing. Now, Burbidge has been had worked for a long, she just passed away last year. She worked very hard to actually work to getting women in astronomy. And for example, when she was given the Annie Cannon Award in '72, she actually turned it down because it was an award reserved for women. She said, I don't want awards which are meant only for women. Let us be on par with men. And finally, in 84, she was awarded the award by the American Astronomical Society, the AAS, which is the Henry Norris Russell Lectureship, which is given, it's not gender based, right? And she got that. She then worked at the University of San Diego, and she did a lot of work. Another very important astronomer is Vera Rubin. Vera Rubin worked in the discovery of what is called dark matter. We won't go into the details of that, but basically this involves a lot of meticulous observations of stars and the motion of stars in galaxies, to the discovery of dark matter. And Vera Rubin worked in that very strongly. Another interesting thing is the Harvard computers. Harvard Observatory was a very well-known observatory. And the director, Edwin Pickering, he realized that women are very good with data. And therefore, he actually hired women as skilled workers. These were called the Harvard computers. So they were not considered astronomers. They were called Harvard computers. And these are a set of the women who worked under him, who to analyze data. Now you can see the bias at that time also. The staff was actually called Harvard computers or Pickering's harem, right? That was the kind of abusive language that was used at that time for his support for women. Now, what the Harvard computers, I can see I'm running a little short in time, included, I'll just talk about three of the women. One was Henrietta Leavitt. Henrietta Leavitt was a very active astronomer over there in the Harvard computers. She actually worked on what are called Cepheid stars. These are variable stars. And these are the very basis. These variables are used as standard candles. That means their brightness is very well known. And using that, Hubble actually came up with his law, which is the law of the expansion of the universe. We know that the universe is actually expanding. And to establish the expansion of the universe, you can see he set up this equation, V is equal to h into d. Velocity of an object is equal to Hubble's constant into the distance. This distance element actually came from the work of Henrietta Leavitt, because he actually looked for Cepheid variables, the kind of stars that Henrietta worked on, to get the d value for various galaxies. So Hubble's law, or the understanding of expansion of the universe, is because of Henrietta Leavitt's work. The other important Harvard astronomer was Annie Jump Cunnin, who worked on stellar spectra. She actually observed the spectra of stars. I can show you. This is how the spectra of stars look, which is actually quite a messy thing, right? It actually looks very messy. Now, these people did very meticulous observations of spectra of hundreds of stars to actually categorize them and put them into what are called spectral classes. So here you can see this is an image of different spectral classes of stars based on these kind of observations. So what I would like you to appreciate is the kind of laborious observations that you're doing to actually make sense of curves of this kind, right? Definitely not an easy job. Another one of this thing is Cecilia Payne. Cecilia Payne in 1925, she was the one who actually in her doctoral thesis established that stars are made up of hydrogen and helium. And initially her conclusion was rejected, but finally it was actually proved that her idea was absolutely correct. So what we can see, what I tried to do through those role models, to basically show you the kind of capabilities that women have shown in the field, right? So you can see that women are obviously as good, but if you actually see, this is a picture for physics and this is for astronomy. And I use the International Astronomical Union, right? So there is what is called the scissors diagram. That means if you actually see the proportion of men and women, right, you will see that men, as you're going to high school students, etc., you can see with bachelor's degree, the number of men increase. As you're going for PhD, it further increases. Becoming assistant, associate professors, it further increases for men. But when it comes to women, these are the number of high school students you have, which gradually drops. A small fraction only gets on to getting bachelor's degrees. A smaller fraction gets PhD degrees, which is like 5% types. And then the proportion of them who actually become assistant professors, associate professors, full professors further falls. So that's for physics. And you can see that it actually, the same thing happens in the case of astronomy. Slightly more women in astronomy, if you see this like this, but again, it falls, right? This is called the scissor diagram. That for men, it's an upward trend as it goes to higher positions. For women, it's a lower trend, right? So what you actually see, the same thing shown over here. If you actually look at graduate students or PhD students, obviously the pink or the red is women, these are men. You can see that when they are graduate students, you have a good amount of the students who are women. You know, there are more men, but still there are good enough amount of women. But as you go up the ladder, right, these people become postdocs, become assistant professors, associate professors, field professors, administrators. You can now see that the ratio of men is to women becomes so biased. Here you already almost have 10 times more, right, of administrator who are men than women, right? Even if at grad school level you have, you know, a 2/3 kind of a proportion. Now, this is often what is called the leaky pipe problem. So the leaky pipe problem means you start off with a good number of women, and then while you go ahead, right, looking for full professors, for directors of institutions, deans in universities, then the number of women becomes very small, which is called the leaky pipe problem. So here you can see, for example, this is specifically for the US, that if you actually see in the US population, the number of white women are approximately 32%, white male are 31%, and this is the distribution of other other racial classes in the US. But when it comes to science and engineering, you can see 51% are all white male, right? Ideally, this should be a representative of the normal population, right? Here you can see that suddenly men are here. The white women are 18%, and you have the Asian men, and then as you go to Asian female, etc., you can see these become really minuscule, right? Ideally, this should be a reflection of this, if you're assuming equal capabilities of everybody, right? So why can't girls be like looking at this stuff? I just have a few slides to finish. I'm sorry. But this is data of the International Astronomical Union, and these are actually snapshots of a talk given by Jocelyn Bell, whom you all heard about earlier, where here she's showing that, for example, for the International Astronomical Union, this is at the global scale. If you look at the world average, only 19% of the members of the International Astronomical Union are women. 80% are all men. If you look at the break in terms of country, you can see in Italy it's 28%, France 26, Brazil 23, Australia 18, the US it's 17%, India 14%, Japan 7%, right? This is data of just last year, which she had presented in some meeting I was attending with her. You can look over here that strangely, if you look at this, okay, I don't have South American countries, but Southern Europe, in these countries, you saw Italy, etc. You saw Italy, etc. You see that Southern European countries, Latin America, have larger amount of females. Northern Europe, English-speaking countries have lower. Limiting factor is culture, obviously not women's brains, and there seems to be similar distribution of physics and maths. What are the possible cultural factors that maybe in these countries, for example, the South European countries, men are in other subjects which they think is more prestigious. In many cases, women, the support they get is from parents. So if parents live nearby, there's a lot of help with child minding. And countries like India, for example, there's a lot of poor people. So you can easily get a poor woman who would be willing to be your housekeeper or your childminder or your maid. So you can get some kind of support for somebody who will handle the home front for you while you are busy doing your work, right? So these are possible cultural factors. Now, obviously, changes have been happening since recent times where a lot of people have, first of all, recognized the problem. It actually took a lot of effort for people to recognize the problem. Earlier, often people used to say, oh, there's no such problem. Why do you people think? That's not true. So now you actually have a whole bunch of people who recognize the problems, and you can see that the numbers have increased in certain countries where people have taken special efforts to see to it that there is more IAU membership of women in some countries, in these countries, for example, including India. And the optimistic point is that suppose now if you look at the age distribution of members, you can see that for the younger generation, 25 to 35, for 332 males, you have 202 females, which is pretty good. Ratio is 1.6. Let's look at the older generation. Here, let's go 75 to 85. You see the ratio is almost 8 times more men than women. But you can see that as we are now progressing with younger age, this is the age group which is going to lead the future. You can see that already you're not reaching a ratio of 1, but you're at least reaching more better ratios, right? So 35 to 45 age group, you have a 2-time this thing, 45 to 55, 3.7. So it is there. I mean, it does happen with me. I have often attended astronomy conferences where, you know, there are just a bunch of women who are attending. Essentially, everybody else is a man. And so we do hope that the future is optimistic because, like you see, the younger generation, we see a better ratio, more healthy ratio. So what we all wish for, I'll be soon ending with this, is that the idea is that there should be a freedom of choice. It is not the question that all women now have to all take up astronomy and physics and maths. That's not the point. The point is that there should be a freedom of choice. Women, men, everybody should have a chance to choose, right? There should be equal opportunities for women and men. Ideally speaking, there should be no requirement for reservation. But the problems we see that we require reservation, for example, in our, for example, government sector where we have reservation, because if there was no reservation, then you would not have any women only, right? So you'll see in India that in universities we have reservations, so you do find female faculty. But in India, for example, in institutes where there is no reservation, right? You will see again in those institutes, there are hardly any women because there's no reservation. So you actually feel that till the time things become, you know, leveled, it is necessary for reservation in the initial stages. But ideally speaking, we should reach a stage where women are there without reservation. I don't get a job because it's a woman's job. I should get a job because I'm on par with everybody else. So the individual should be non-gender, right? An individual has to be rated as an individual because after all, other than reproductive organs and hormones, which we have, there is obviously no major difference, right, between men and women and their capabilities. So ideally speaking, that's the kind of world we would wish for. And I'll end with this final thing, again, in support of astronomy, that astronomy is useful because it actually raises us above ourselves. It's useful because it's grand. It shows us how small is mind's body, how great his mind, since his intellect can embrace the whole of this dazzling immensity, where his body is only an obscure point, and enjoy its silent harmony. So these are the words of Henri Poincaré, and whether you ignore it or not, you would notice again, he says, how small is a man's body? So you see that there has always been this bias, right, to a man. And that's what we need to work against. And let's hope we do have a good world where this kind of a bias does not exist. So thank you. I'll end with this, and I'm sorry for slightly overshooting. And please put your questions.
Yeah. I'd like to ask a question.
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead, please.
Yeah. With Dr. Hassan, it's really nice to see the passion that you have for your work. It comes through in your talk. I had a question that, you said that stars have elements like, which become heavier and heavier, like the calcium in our bones and there's iron, etc. Now, our sun is also a star. So what elements exist there?
Okay, so thanks. That's a good question. So the sun also, see, actually the stars are basically nuclear fusion reactors. By fusion, you mean you join lighter elements to produce heavier elements.
Yeah.
And that's essentially what the sun does. But the sun is a very moderate star. So what happens is, as you go to heavier and heavier elements, the repulsion between the fusing elements, right, that repulsion becomes stronger. So what happens is you need very high temperatures for fusion to take place. Now the sun is not very, is not very massive, and therefore it does not have very high temperatures. Its core gets up to 1 million degrees or 100 million degrees. It doesn't get hotter than that. So it does not go on to fusing very heavy elements. It goes on till fusing only a certain amount of elements. It'll end up with a lot of carbon, a certain amount of calcium, but not till the very end. Basically because it's not a very massive star. So the heavy elements which we have in us, for example, the gold you're wearing is fused in some other star. So what happens is when stars form and then they die out, they essentially give out all their elements to what is called the interstellar medium. From the interstellar medium, you have a fresh set of stars which form. And therefore, you kind of, a star inherits part of its heavy elements from earlier generations of stars. So the sun has also inherited part of its heavy elements from earlier generations of stars. And that is so the gold, etc., which we have are inheritance from earlier generation, right? So the Earth also formed as part of the solar, the solar nebula when the sun was forming. And that's how we got it. And that in a way explains the abundance of elements. So heavier elements, there's lack of them because there is lack of them, right? The sun is not producing it. It's just what we inherited in that this thing, right? So that kind of explains why you have a lesser amount of platinum. The atomic number of platinum is larger, right? So the sun cannot fuse it. This has to be fused by an earlier generation, right? So the sun is fusing, but not till the very end because it's not so massive, right? And the most explosive event in a star is what is called a supernova, and that's when there's a lot of energy released. That's when you have these heavy elements, for example, like gold and platinum, things like that form in that kind of an event, which will not happen with the sun. So the sun is not going to produce it. Right? Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you.
Yes,
Hi.
Rekha. You have
Hello,
a
good
question?
afternoon,
Go
Dr.
ahead.
Hassan. Good
Yeah.
afternoon.
Good
I
afternoon.
wanted to tell you your talk was absolutely riveting and it's such a fascinating area of study. I just wanted to make an observation. I appreciated the fact that when you read out the names of the women astronomers, you left out their married names and just called out the first two names. I thought that was fantastic. Thank you.
Any other questions, please, quickly? We'll just take one or two questions and then wind up. I think there are no
I don't
more
know.
questions.
There's another interesting observation on astronomy that I would like to make. That do you know, in ancient times, it's only in around the 18th century or 17th century that they got the longitudinal medium at Greenwich. But in ancient times, the Indian astronomers who were very, very advanced in their field, and they knew that it was a heliocentric system.
Yeah.
Ujjain used to be where the Greenwich mean time, the 0 degree latitude used to pass. And I mean, I've been reading a lot on ancient Indian astronomy, and I just find it fascinating that what the ancients knew. Unfortunately, the West doesn't give enough credence to it.
That's right. But I would also like to say that India, essentially as a country or civilization, none of our rulers actually went to other countries to capture them, you know. So for them, navigation was not a big issue like it was with the case of Britain and France, because for them, it was essential to come out of their island countries, you know, to cross the seas. While I don't know, I mean, maybe some of you all may be better at sense. No, not many of them went
I think
yeah.
I think there's a reason. It's a cultural reason. We always try to, and the Indians or the ancients always tried to see themselves in the universe, not in terms of just capturing countries and doing that. They wanted to understand the world, and it's amazing how much they did by just observing
Southeast
the stars.
Asia. If you see Southeast Asia, you know, Cambodia, Angkor Wat, all those countries.
Yes.
There is a very strong Indian influence over there.
Yeah.
Influence, and there's a lot of astronomy that goes back, because you know they found that in the Vedas, in the Rig Veda alone, there are 800 astronomical observations. So we are talking of the most ancient text in the world, and the astronomical observations of that time. And everybody talks about the discovery of understanding that the sun was the center of the earth. The ancients in India knew that a long, long time ago.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
anyway,
that was very, very scintillating, Priya. Very inspiring. And it opened our eyes to the gender bias that we know exists, but in what all fields it exists, you know, it made us aware of that. And I hope that
the most important part about it is that it's so much in us that we do not even realize that we have this bias.
Yes,
yes. So recognizing that there is a bias, in the way we treat girls and boys in the family, or there is a bias, and you have to really consciously work against that bias if you know, don't want to force your girls to do certain things. Or even the boys. Why shouldn't the boys also have the freedom of choosing what they want to do? They don't have to become engineers. Right? Not all boys want to. Okay.
Yes. So now I will ask Lakshmi Chinnam to give final vote of thanks.
Good morning, ladies. Good morning, Priya.
Good morning.
Wonderful session we have. And, you know, when I'm just checking, today is Baba Saheb Ambedkar's Jayanti. And he's such a good scholar. And we are spending time with you to, you know, get more knowledge where, how, and astronomy, astrology, all these things you can differentiate. You know, and nowadays I see there is no calendar in anybody's house. There used to be a long calendars with Bhagwan, Ganesha, this, or, you know, table calendars. But now we ended up with a calendar on your phone. Okay. But today you are introducing us to solar calendar, lunar solar calendars, how these impact our lives, seasons, festivals. And today we are maybe, you know, learn to answer our grandkids maybe, because we all are at that age group, you know. Okay, why this festival is come this time, what happens to this season. I think, yeah, quite a bit of learning, but with the immense knowledge what you have, Priya, it is difficult to, you know, absorb even a bit of it. But all the best to your organization, Srishti. I think we Wednesday Ladies members, you know, should spread a word about this organization where children can get more knowledge and get more exposure towards this. And as far as bias is concerned, I think Wednesday Club is much, much ahead of all this. And all I keep seeing children in different areas, shining, sparkling. I guess it's nice to know about this. Thank you, Priya. Have a good day.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much.
Thank you,
for having
Priya,
me.
once more for being so gracious to accept my invitation in just
Pleasure.
one request, and you accepted it. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot. Thanks so
So,
much. for having me.
ladies, meet you again, ladies, for the SIG meeting. Please be there. We have another unusual topic on in our SIG this time, so please do attend. We will call it off. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.